Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Cancian, a senior advisor here at CSIS. Welcome to our program this afternoon. We're honored to have General McConville, Chief of Staff of the Army, join us for a conversation about the Army and its future and the challenges it faces in the current national security environment. General, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, Mark, it's great to be here with you.
Well, the first question that comes up when we are looking out at the national security environment, of course, is about Ukraine. That's dominated the news for the last 2 weeks. The Army has been very involved with supporting our NATO allies. So why don't we start off with just a description about what the Army is doing and what you see the challenges there.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. And the Army has a significant role in what's going on in Eastern Europe right now, and it really starts with reassuring our allies and partners with the situation that's going on in Ukraine, and also making sure we deter any further aggression. And so we have a 4-star headquarters over there under Chris Cavoli. We actually have 2 corps over there, the 5th Corps, which is focused on Europe, and also the 18th Airborne Corps, which is deployed. 2 divisions, the 82nd Airborne Division, the 1st Infantry Division, and then we have multiple brigades ranging from a Striker Brigade, the 2CR, an Airborne Brigade, the 173rd. We sent over a brigade from the 82nd. We have a rotational brigade from the 1st Infantry Division, and then we just sent over another armor brigade from the 3rd Infantry Division that actually drew our pre-positioned stocks there. So we have a very robust capability there to reassure allies and to deter any further aggression.
Well, I have to ask the follow-on question that I keep getting when I talk to audiences about this. Now, the President has been quite emphatic that these forces are there to reassure our allies and to support NATO, that he does not see any possibility that they would move into Ukraine. But let me ask the question, is there any possibility that U.S. forces could end up in a confrontation with Russia?
Well, I think the President's very clear. I know the SecDef has been very clear with us, is we do not want to have a great power war. And so we are there, and that's what we're telling the troops, to reassure our allies and partners, keep NATO together, and also deter any further aggression.
Great. And one follow-on question here that again comes up, and do you see any change to our posture in Europe as a result of this experience? Going back a couple of years, of course, we were pulling forces out of Europe, then that was stabilized when Russia went into Crimea and the eastern provinces of Ukraine. But now that there's a conflict and we've surged so many forces over there, do you see any longer-term change in our posture?
Well, I do think that's going to be a policy decision and probably a question and decision. What's it look like in the future? I know that countries over there, we saw with Germany, have taken like a major sea change, if you will, as far as their strategy. We've seen that change in days, and the fact that you do need to have credible combat forces in theater to prevent these type of things from happening. And I think what will happen is we'll take a look at the options available. We have permanent forces over there. We have rotational forces, and we dynamically employed other forces. So there's multiple options that we in the Army can provide our decision makers, and we plan to do that.
Great. Well, and one more question here. You mentioned NATO, and I realize that we have a regional commander and don't want to step on his prerogatives, but you talk to a lot of our NATO allies, and you mentioned Germany specifically, which has made this tremendous turnaround in just the last couple of weeks. Do you see a different spirit in NATO? Do you see changes that are occurring there among our allies?
Well, I take a look. I think NATO's stronger than it's ever been. We've always had great relationships, myself personally, with the chiefs of staffs of the armies in Europe. But I think it's one of those type of things people couldn't imagine that something like this could happen. And I think it's kind of sparked discussion that we need to be prepared to defend ourselves and against an unprovoked attack that we're seeing right now in Ukraine.
Great. Okay. Okay. Well, we can, I think, move on to some other topics, but I'm sure this will come up again in some of the questions we get from the audience. Moving to the budget and some of the initiatives that fall out of that, readiness, modernization, people. In the last budget in FY22, at least in the president's submission, the Army had to make some tough choices. It maintained its end strength more or less and took some cuts to readiness and modernization. Do you think that the Army is going to need to continue that, or is it going to be able to put more emphasis on those other areas?
We're waiting to see what the final budget is, and we're still waiting for 22. We're in a continuing resolution that'll help inform what 23 looks like, and then that'll probably inform what 24 looks like. But what we're trying to do, and the Secretary and I, is we're trying to give the best Army we can with the resources we have. And so when we look at people, we look at readiness, and we look at modernization, we're trying to optimize within those areas. So people talk about end strength. To me, when it comes to end strength, is we want high quality people throughout the Army, and it's a matter of what does that look like. And when it comes to readiness, we're not going to send troops in harm's way without being ready. So we want to really make sure that's very, very efficient on how we do that. And then on modernization, we have legacy systems, we have enduring systems, and we have future systems. And the legacy systems we're going to get rid of. The endurance systems, we've been incrementally improving them, and as we bring these new systems on in the future, we're going to see the enduring systems probably start to reduce, but they're still going to be here for a while. And we're trying to find that sweet spot where all these are synchronized together, and that's what the budget's all about.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we talk about each one of these focus areas? We can start with readiness. The Army was quite clear back in sort of 2015, 2016 that readiness was not acceptable, that many Army brigades were not at the readiness level that it wanted. Then there was a buildup of resources, and the Army said that that now the brigades were in much better shape readiness-wise. And I was wondering if you could make a comment about where the Army readiness is today, given that we had the budget sort of peaked maybe 2 years ago, and the resources maybe.
Well, I'm very pleased with the Army's readiness. I think it's to me the proof's in the execution. When I take a look at take a brigade from the 82nd Airborne Division, we deployed them 4 times, no notice, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, and now to Europe. And one of the interesting deployments we just had, the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Infantry, a armored brigade combat team. Historically, it takes a long time to deploy an organization like that. We basically deployed them in almost less than a week. And in fact, so fast, I was going down to visit them last weekend, and they were gone before I could actually get down there. But what allowed us to do that was readiness. And people go, well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, the troops are all ready to go. They're trained in their skill sets. The platoons, the companies, battalions were all trained, so they were ready to deploy. The other thing that was ready is we have pre-positioned stocks over in Europe. So they were able to go over there and draw equipment that was in a high state of readiness. And so they were quickly able to get up. They're on the ranges right now shooting. And that's what readiness is all about. But there's multiple units that were able to do that. And we're seeing that happen all the time. And our Guard forces and our reserve forces are also at a much higher state of readiness. We had a brigade from Minnesota, the Red Bulls. They were involved in the social unrest in Minneapolis, and they went from there. They went to our National Training Center, and they really weren't able to get their readiness above the platoon level. But once they got into that environment, because they were highly trained at the platoon level, they quickly got up to brigade level. They deployed to the Middle East, and one of the battalions even ended up doing operations in Kabul. So even with what we're seeing with our Guard and Reserve, are bringing a sense of readiness that we just haven't seen. So we're very pleased with readiness, but it's fragile. We always have to continue to invest in it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned pre-positioning, and I know that the Army rebuilt its pre-positioning stocks, in Europe, thanks to what was then the European Reassurance Initiative, later the European Deterrence Initiative. And I was wondering if you could just say a little about, the effect that has had on the Army and its stance in Europe.
Well, when you talk about speed, how fast you can get troops to respond, and how much transportation capabilities it takes. So we launched the 82nd Airborne Division, the headquarters, and also a brigade from the 82nd. They were able to draw their vehicles because we have an infantry brigade combat team worth of vehicles over there and do that very, very quickly. So they didn't have to take as many C-17s and tie up, all those type of capabilities going forward. Same thing with an armored brigade combat team. We're able to send them over there without their equipment, and they can draw very quickly, and they don't have to wait for the ship to show up, and the same thing with many other type units. So it gives us a capability to quickly get forces into place. Now, we also have an armored brigade combat team over there that is a rotational brigade that's there with their equipment. And then we have an airborne brigade in Italy, and we have a striker brigade in Germany, and there's others that are supporting that. So we have a pretty robust capability.
Great. Well, let's talk about modernization, because of course that looms large when we think about the Army of the future. The Army has the 31+4, and I was wondering about the process by which you're going to select which one of those programs are going to become programs of record, and sort of what their status is now.
Yeah, what I'm saying is 24 and 23. So out of the 35 systems, we're going to deliver 24 of these modernization efforts in 2023, which is really pretty amazing when you think about acquisition process. Now, not everyone is going to be completely finished as far as all the testing, but it'll be in the hands of soldiers by 23. And we've taken a hard look at our priorities. Our priorities are long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, the network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. And we haven't changed those priorities. And, new secretary came in, and she's in agreement, and we've had those priorities for the last 4.5 years. Now, as far as the systems, we're taking a look at the resources we have. And as I've often talked to industry, we believe we need those modernization efforts over the next 25, 30 years. That's what is going to happen, just like we modernized the Army basically 40 years ago when I came in the Army, and we've incrementally improved it since. We're going to reset the capabilities in the Army, and those systems will take us through the next 30 or 40 years. And so, what we're telling industry is we got some tough decisions, but one way to avoid, make decisions less than easy is to make sure your programs are on cost, they're on performance, and they're on schedule.
Well, when you say that there are, 23 programs that will be coming online.
24 and 23.
Okay, and 24 and 23.
Yeah.
Well, do you mean that they will be programs of record, or that they will have equipment in the field that will?
Yeah, they'll be in the hands of soldiers. I'll start like hypersonic missile battery. We're going to have a hypersonic missile battery that's in the hands of soldiers that's ready to be deployed. We're going to have a mid-range capability, which is the ability to sink ships, a battery in the hands of soldiers. We're going to have a Prism strike missile battery in the hands of soldiers. We're going to have an extended range cannon artillery battery in the hands of soldiers. Now, is there more development that needs to be done? But the soldiers will be using those systems. They'll be able to work with those systems, and we're seeing that happen as we speak.
And when you say in the hands of soldiers, are these going to be demonstrators, or is there actually a program of record that extends to the fit up and plan to buy more?
These are programs of record. Now, they may not have met the program of record standard. It may be first unit issued. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be first unit equipped. There is a difference in terms, as I've talked to our acquisition professionals, where they are along. But, there's a battalion or there's a battery there's real people that exist. If, for a hypersonics battery, we have a company commander selected, we have soldiers selected. They're going through all the training, so when the missiles arrive next year, they can employ them the way we want them to employ them.
Mm-hmm. When we've had people come in and talk about the Pacific, and we'll talk about that a little later, one of the comments they make is that they would make a different set of priorities. They would put long-range precision fires and air defense high up. Right. They would not put as much emphasis on ground combat vehicles or future vertical lift.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what is the Army's argument for its prioritization?
Yeah, well, first of all, the number one priority is long-range precision fires, so we're there. And when you take a look at what you want an Army to do, other services would say, we want you to provide us long-range fires, and we want you to secure our bases, and that's good, and that's part of our role. But you win on the offense, and if you want an Army to do what it does, to deter those who wish us harm, I make the argument, you got to be able to move, shoot, and communicate. Or shoot, move, and communicate, or somewhere in between. And so, we have long-range fires. That's a good program. We run the gamut, from tactical fires to long-range fires, and I think we're in a good place right there. Right now, if you're going to move infantry, and the core of the United States Army in some ways is going to be soldiers on the ground. We want to give them a ground vehicle that's not 40 or 50 years old. I would hate to leave to future soldiers or future chiefs our 60 to 80-year-old vehicle because we haven't modernized our ground vehicles. And we're also, within that portfolio, taking care of robotics. So we're going to have unmanned teaming on the ground, in the air, in combinations. We think that's really important. When it comes to future vertical lift, we want aircraft that have 2 to 3 times the speed of the aircraft we have right now. So they can go they have speed and they have range, and they can conduct the type of operations that we have. Again, the aircraft we have today are very, very capable, but they're based on 40 to 50 years old. They came into the Army when I was there, so we certainly have to replace them. On air and missile defense, I argue that one of the threats that we're getting after most is the unmanned aerial systems. I think at every level, whether it's violent extremists to great powers, a threat to all of our services, a threat to a lot of Americans, threats to embassies is going to be unmanned aerial systems, lethal, and we've got to spend a lot of work on that, developing capabilities, which we are, to go ahead and defeat those systems.
And what is the answer there? I know that we've looked at electronic systems, and we've looked at intercept systems. I mean, do you have a sense about where we are in that effort?
I do. I think the answer is there is not one answer. And what do I mean by that? I think we're going with Project Convergence and Joint All-Domain Command and Control, and these type of ideas is I envision multiple sensors, and that the sensors are going to be able to pick up these unmanned aerial systems at different levels and different sensors, and then they have to come back into some type of battle command system that is enabled by artificial intelligence that quickly takes that data, moves it through that command system, and gets it to the right arrow in the quiver, if you will. So when we take a look at how we're going to defeat unmanned aerial systems, the big ones, it could be Patriot missile. The smaller ones, it could be Stinger-type missiles, it could be gun systems, it could be direct NG systems, it could be directed, high-powered microwave. There's a lot of different systems, and it's really going to depend on what type of unmanned aerial system you have. Because if you have a missile, you don't want to shoot, Patriot missiles at $100,000 UASs. We're going to see swarms, hundreds, maybe thousands of unmanned aerial systems coming to us, so you have to come up with a different approach that's going to allow you to defeat those type systems. And we envision adversaries, right now some of the systems aren't very sophisticated based on how they're commanded and controlled or the facilities they have, and so some systems will work today, but just like we saw with the IEDs, there'll be counter capabilities, and we'll have to get better, and we'll have to work at it. But I do that is a major concern of mine right now.
Mm-hmm. And while we're talking about unmanned, let's talk a little about what the Army is doing for unmanned. There's a lot of interest in that. When I talk to people about the conflict in Ukraine, they're very interested in unmanned systems that are being used by the Ukrainians and the Russians. You mentioned swarming as a possible tactic in the future. So can you say a little about what the Army is doing for unmanned and swarming?
Yeah, I think when we take a look at unmanned, first of all, there's kind of like the philosophical thought on how do you use unmanned systems. You know, I believe both on air and ground, you should never have a manned aircraft like going through an integrated air and missile defense system. You know, we ought to, you know, let's lead with unmanned as we deal with those problems. You know, on the ground, if you have to go through, if you're clearing roads or clearing minefields, you know, that ought to be done with unmanned type systems. And so I can see, you know, I call it T-bone tactics, is where you might have a person in the loop in a manned aircraft, but out in front there's unmanned capability both in the air and on the ground, finding targets, making contact with the enemies or obstacles first, and then allowing you to maneuver. And I think there's still need, although we're making a lot of progress on robotics. We've done some pretty interesting things with the ability to use autonomous vehicles on the ground or remote vehicles on the ground, and that's coming along very, very nicely. A lot better than I thought we could do, but that's going to change how we do business. But one of the systems that we have is the Integrated Visual Augmentation System. We call it IVAS. And what it really allows us to do for our soldiers is it's like a heads-up display that they can see better with night vision, but they also can bring in any type of visual type capability and almost going into an augmented reality. And what I can see in the future is you're sitting maybe in a command vehicle or command aircraft, and you have unmanned aircraft and unmanned vehicles out in front of you, and you can flick a switch and you want to go, I want to see what vehicle number 1 is seeing. And you can almost go into virtual reality where you think you're in that vehicle, or you go up to the aircraft, or you can go around the battlefield and put yourself virtually in each of those vehicles or each of those aircraft and help define and see what you're doing much better than we've ever been done in the past. So there's tremendous capability to move forward with that.
Mm-hmm. And you've sort of answered a question, again, that I frequently get when I talk to journalists about Ukraine, and that is about the future of rotary winged aircraft. You know, the Russians appear to have lost a bunch of them in their efforts to, you know, take Kyiv early on. You mentioned about the teaming. So I wonder if you could just say a word about, you know, your vision for the future of rotary wing.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I took away from as I watch what's happening in Ukraine is the value of the successes of the TB2s, which is the unmanned aerial systems being operated by the Ukrainians. And, you know, some would argue that those systems are, you know, legacy because they're operating, you know, in a very high risk air defense system. But when it comes to aircraft, with tactics, techniques, and procedures, you're going to need vertical lift capability. You know, I think people envision that integrated air and missile defense is like a wall that you can't get through it. There's ways you can get around. There's ways you can get through it. There's techniques and procedures. You can suppress with kinetic. You can suppress with non-kinetic means, and then you give. You provide commanders a lot of options, and you also provide adversaries a lot of dilemmas. And one of the things, you know, because people ask me, well, we don't think that aircraft or vertical lift or helicopters survive in the future. Well, I tend to differ, and we've done some very detailed analysis on how to employ them, and we think they are. But the other thing I would argue is we're going to have soldiers on the battlefield. I command the 101st Airborne Division. And when you have soldiers on the battlefield, you're going to have to go get them. And, you know, we need to have that capability to get them. We need to have the capability to support them. And, you know, I can think of many, many scenarios where we want a high-speed vertical capability to go get American citizens, to get, you know, to support American embassies, to support American troops, to do medevac, a whole bunch of reasons why we need that capability. But to me, and even the Pacific, having the speed and the range and then taking advantage of convergence, bringing all the intelligence and sensors together, I think that's going to give us decision dominance, and I think we need it.
Well, that's a good segue to, I think, the next topic, which is people, one of the Army pillars.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little about talent management. That's a, you know, very popular topic now, particularly how the Army's going to get the expertise it needs in so hard to recruit specialties like cyber?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it's about people first in the Army. I look at people as our greatest strength, our most important weapon system. I believe we're in a war for talent. I think we're trying to do in the Army right now is move from an industrial age personnel management system to a talent management system. And you talked about, hey, we need people with like cyber skills, computer skills. We have them in the Army, and we have really good ones. And one of the things I've learned over time is our personnel system is kind of industrial age. We manage people by two variables. You're a sergeant of engineers, you're a captain of infantry. We just stood up a software factory down in Austin because we know we're going to have to code on the edge of the battlefield to be able to, basically write algorithms. If we're going to use artificial intelligence, if we're going to do the things we're doing with Project Convergence, we need people that can write code. So we put out a request to see who was interested in that, and we got some incredible people whose talents were being masked by their two variables, by their MOS and their grade. And by way of example, we have a medic down there. He's a specialist, so he's an E4 medic. He codes at the PhD level, and he's self-taught, and so he's an integral member. We also have some PhDs from Johns Hopkins and some of the other best places in the world that do coding, but we also have a baker down there, a person who in the Army is supposed to be a cook. And he also codes at the PhD level, and we have an automotive mechanic. So what we're finding with talent management, first we got to be able to identify those talents, and we got to be able to certify them, because quite frankly, that specialist, we're going to want to keep them, and we got to figure out how we take care of that person and make sure they're credentialed at that level. And that's how we're moving into the future. We're in a war for talent, and we want to keep the best and brightest young men and women in the Army.
And could you talk a little then about the quality of life efforts in the Army? Of course, those are ongoing, and very often they say you recruit the soldier, but you retain the families.
Yeah, and I say it all the time because I believe it is. The thing about the Army is 89% of our sergeants and above have families. So guess what? If we want sergeants and above to stay in the Army, which we do, and that's what makes us the Army we are, great non-commissioned officers and officers staying, we've got to provide a quality of life that's commensurate with their service. And so, our priorities, and the Secretary and I, we're spending a lot of money on housing. Just like we want people to have a good place to live. We want the soldiers to have good billets. We're certainly concerned about medical care. We're spending a lot of money on child development centers. We're doing a lot on policy to encourage families to stay in the Army. We got a lot of dual military couples, or dual professional couples, and if we don't have the right child care, they're going to go someplace else, so we're spending a lot of money on that. We're very interested in taking care of spouses with spousal employment, because many of us have had, my wife, we've moved all over the place, 25, I don't know how many moves, I can't even keep them in account, but we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to thrive with their employment, so we're working on that. And then we're also, moves are hard, and we're trying to make the moves a lot better. We've had a lot of challenges during COVID with people moving, and getting acceptable moves. So all those type things matter when it comes to quality of life, and we are investing in those. We don't have it right, not exactly the way we want, but we are putting a lot of resources into it.
Well, you mentioned housing, and 2 years ago or so, of course, that was a terrible problem. The problems in privatized housing. But you don't hear about it now, which is a good sign.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just talk a little about what the Army did to get it out of the news.
Well, we did a lot of things, and it was a team effort. And by that is, we put in a Bill of Rights, and Congress had to do that with, we have private, about 85% of the housing in the United States Army is privatized. So you're working with a company, and those companies are responsible for providing quality housing. So we went after it pretty hard. We put incentive fees in place. We put checks and balances in place where people check the checkers. Our soldiers and families have a lot more rights when it comes to not getting quality housing. They put a lot of money into housing, and we put a lot of money into housing. And when you get the resources going, and you get the right checkers in place, and we've worked that really hard, and we focused on it. And so housing is better, but it's always going to be a challenge. You know, what happens at our level is, every decision is a trade-off. Do you want end strength? Do you want readiness? Do you want modernization? Do you want good housing? Do you want good runways? Do you want, whatever, rail yards? I mean, it's we don't have enough resources, and we're trying to use them as efficiently as we can. But we had a problem with housing. It was affecting our families, so we put a lot of resources into it.
Great. Let's talk a little about the Pacific. Of course, all the attention for the last month or so has been in Europe, but the Pacific, China's still going to be the pacing threat when the National Defense Strategy comes out and when the current crisis maybe dies down.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little about the Army in the Pacific.
Yeah, I think, I take a look at the Army in the Pacific, a lot of people go, hey, this is, mostly a maritime theater. What does the Army do? I think the Army has a lot to offer the combatant commanders. And, a lot of it's setting the theater. There's one thing, when we think about the Army, we're talking about war fighting, but the Army does logistics, in a way that very few organizations can. If you take a look at COVID and Operation Warp Speed and a lot of the type things, or you see what we're doing in Europe right now, we can move people, we can move things. So when you take a look at what you'd need in the Pacific, you'd need very aggressive logistics. We do that very well. We command and control very, very well. You can see how we orchestrate multiple capabilities. So I see, we have a 4-star headquarters out there. We have a corps out there. We have 2 divisions out there, and we see them providing those capabilities. Long-range precision fires, I know I've talked to the COCOM commanders over the last couple of years. They want us to have long-range precision fires, and they want us the ability to sink ships. We're going to have those capabilities very soon. And then air and missile defense, very, very concerned about what we're doing with convergence to bring together that protection, not only with THAAD, Patriot, but the indirect fire capability to help them with counter UAS, and then ground troops. You're going to have ground troops. A lot of people, that go, well, what's the Army do? It's in the water, but the people live on land, and most decisive things in war, at the end of the day, are going to happen on the land. We had 22 divisions out there during World War II. We're certainly not going to get to those numbers, but there's definitely a need to have combat troops on the ground to reassure allies and partners and work with them very closely.
One of the questions I sometimes get is about Guam, because that's further west of U.S. territory.
Sure.
We've got some other bases, of course, further west with Japan. What do you, and the Army has, does not have a large presence on Guam, but I mean, what do you see about the future of Guam?
I think Guam, as you said, it's extremely important to protect. There's a lot of capability there that we can move in and out because we have access there and we have presence there. And I think, the Army will have a role in providing certainly some of the protection. That's what we do right now. We do have some protection capability out there, and I can see that possibly increasing depending on the posture review that's going on out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, I have a bunch more questions,
Sure.
but I know we also have some from our audience, so I'm going to give them a chance and then maybe
Sure.
come back to mine a little later. But the first one I think you've sort of covered, but I'll ask it again, which is about future vertical lift and whether the experience in Afghanistan and Ukraine has changed any thinking about future vertical lift.
Yeah, I think, well, I go to Afghanistan. I absolutely think that talking, go to Afghanistan, I was just speaking with the AFRICOM commander, and he would love to have future vertical lift. The ability to go very fast and very far in those type of theaters is absolutely critical. So if you have an aircraft that goes 250 to 300 knots, most of us, when we're maneuvering in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq, the long pole or the governor constraint becomes medevac. So if we're flying a Black Hawk, you figure, it's the golden hour, so your range is about 100 nautical miles because you want to be able to get to the person, pick them up, and bring them back. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, then you have to have some place to bring them back to. You need to have some type of surgical capability. You need to have some type of fuel capability. And next thing you know, you have a large little, forward operating base you have to maintain just so you can operate in 100 miles. But if you can go 300 miles in that same amount of time, then you've just given yourself much more range. You've given yourself many, many more options. And even as we look at different countries, the ability to go from a friendly place to some place that's not as friendly gives you a lot more options. So I absolutely think that we need future vertical lift. And you take a look in the islands in the Pacific, absolutely. And even when we go to Ukraine, if you can fly a unmanned aerial system around at a couple thousand feet, you can fly a helicopter around with the right capabilities and the right countermeasures on it, and give you that capability to quickly move troops where you need to do that.
Great. We have a question here about NATO again. And this is about rationalization, standardization, interoperability. I mean, a long-time goal of the alliance, and also about Polish acquisition of Abrams. And I think they just signed that deal. But I was wondering if you could talk about the standardization.
Yeah, I think a lot of people talk about interoperability. We want to integrate with each other, and one of the best ways to do that is we've set up security force assistance brigades, so we're advising and assisting together. As you mentioned, the Polish Army is very, very interested in Abrams tanks, and so if they're using the same equipment, and we're training together, and we're working together, which we want to do, it just makes us so much stronger together. So what I see, one of the biggest concerns, my counterparts have, chiefs, is we have a very aggressive modernization program, and they want to make sure they stay with us. And when I talk about joint all-domain command and control, JADC2, I add a C to it because I want it to be combined. And we're doing a lot of work on figuring out how to pass data. You would think, hey, we're commanders. Why are you worried about data? Data is going to be the secret of the future. If you want to get lethal effects very, very quickly, if you want to have integrated allies and partners, or interoperability, I would say integrated is even better. The ability to pass data back very, very quickly. And we've got really smart people working on that with a data fabric that's going to allow us to do that. And it's hard work and it's challenging, but that's going to fundamentally change the speed in which we can do things. I argue that a weapon system will have so much speed, it'll have so much range, but the power of this convergence makes things happen a lot quicker. I used to use the argument with helicopters. We talked about helicopters, being 101st, commander and those type things, and being a aviation commander. If we had a helicopter that went 100 miles an hour, and it takes you 10 hours to do all the planning to get them off, you're really only responding at 10 miles an hour. If you're responding at 10 miles an hour, you might as well use a truck for that ground commander because you're not moving very fast. That's how the speed works. When you take a look at some of these systems, we may have hypersonic missile capability that goes really fast, but if the process to get it onto a target takes hours or days, then it's not very responsive. So that's what we mean by that.
One question we have is about the Arctic. I guess the Army did its first Arctic CTC rotation, and of course the Arctic's getting a lot more attention. Yeah. The Army's been in the Arctic for a long time. They've got forces up there in Alaska and an Arctic Training Center, and I was wondering if you could talk about the Army's
well, I think we're all reckoning. We just came out with our Arctic strategy a little while past, and we're taking a look at some of the things we want to do to really operationalize that. The headquarters we have up in the Arctic, the two-star headquarters, is really an administrative type headquarters. We see in the future that being a much more operational, capable headquarters. We're taking a look at, we have a Stryker brigade up there. We're seeing, is that the right type of brigade? Are we better to have an Arctic brigade that is equipped to operate in the environment rather than be based in the environment and go from someplace else? We're looking at the possibility of putting a multi-domain task force up in the Arctic. We're working on a lot of different things, options, but at the end of the day, we want our troops to be able to operate up there. We think that's going to be a place that's going to be competitive, and we want to make sure we have the troops that are trained and equipped to operate, during the winter, which is very, very challenging time frames, and we have lots of big exercise going on there right now.
Great. We have a question about Korea and about the planning for the total force there, and particularly how Korea fits into the vision for the Indo-Pacific, given that it's a very different kind of fight than we would have in the South China Sea or over Taiwan?
Well, I take a look at Korea, and General Cameron's over there as an Army general. We certainly have a capability with ground forces that work very closely with our Korean partners there. And when I take a look at Korea, I take a look at Asia. There's places that we have interest on. A lot of those interests align with the ground. And I think the fact that we're there reassures those partners. And I take a look at actually South Korea. We've been there a long time. And you look at what that country has done, how it's modernized, and the fact that there's stability on that peninsula. And I think we help provide that. And I think the fact that we're there deters others from maybe doing other things they should be doing. And I think the Koreans have certainly improved their country along with their military over the many years we've been there.
The next question is about the multi-domain task forces, which the Army's been working on for a while. I think they've stood up at least one of them, and the question is about what the future of these task forces is and what they're going to look like. Yeah,
well, we have two of them right now. We have one in the Pacific, and we have one in Europe. And what they do, and we're developing, as we speak, we're building them as we work, and we're working them around the Pacific, and we're stood up a new one in Europe, and we intend to stand up 5. So we're going to have 5 eventually is what we want them to be. And what they do is they do two things, or two major things. They provide long-range precision effects and long-range precision fires. So the long-range precision effects will be used during whether you call it the competition phase or the coordination phase or the campaigning phase. But what they can do is, through intelligence, through information operations, through cyber, electronic warfare, and space, they can provide long-range precision effects. The other thing they're going to do is provide long-range precision fires. They will have a battalion of capability with, hypersonic. Right now there's a base, but they'll be tailored. But they'll have hypersonic missile capability battery. They'll have a mid-range capability to sink ships, and they'll probably have a PRISM capability to provide long-range precision fires. So they'll be able to do that. And when you think about what they could do, they could sink ships, they can penetrate integrated air and missile defense, they can be augmented with air and missile defense and provide anti-access and air denial. I could envision them providing no-fly areas, no-sail areas, and they'll have a lot of capability as an option for the combatant commanders in each of their areas. But they're going to be pretty much focused on the Pacific and Europe.
Mm-hmm. So they're going to combine, sort of artillery functions, air defense functions, maybe cyber and...
That's right. If you look at it, what they're going to do is provide effects. Some of those effects will be what we call non-kinetic, like information operations, cyber, electronic warfare, and space, and all the time, augmented by the ability to gather intelligence. And then they're going to have a kinetic capability, whether it's hypersonics, it's mid-range capability, or it's PRISM, or they could be augmented with air and missile defense capability to provide an anti-access air denial capability if required.
The next question, again, focuses on the Pacific. Part of it's about air and missile defense. I think you've discussed that. But the other part is about air-based ground defense, which has been an Army function. And I was wondering, how is the Army, going to perform that function? Are they going to use regular troops? Is it going to get more extensive?
Well, I think it depends on where those air bases are and what the priority is. And there's a lot of, if we took the Army and divided up the Army just into every single air base, and that would be all we would probably do. So, we're certainly in the high-risk type bases where you need military force. We're certainly providing Patriot missile capability or THAAD capability at many of those type bases. And the discussion is going on right now. What's the right level of protection that we need to provide, for the mission?
Mm-hmm. Okay. We have a question here about the OMFV. I think it's the Optionally Manned Fighting Vehicle program, right. And sort of its status. If you can talk to that.
Yeah, I can. We're in the process of developing that system. We're taking probably a non traditional model, which we're doing, is we've gone out to industry after doing market research and said, we want a vehicle that has this type of characteristics. You notice I didn't say requirements, I said characteristics. And what we asked them to do is to come back for an initial concept with what that vehicle may look like. And they come back and, we kind of look at it and, and then say, okay, come back, you are, so many of you have been chosen to go further in the process and come back with like an initial design and then maybe a full design to a prototype. And then when we get to the prototype and we see what people can actually produce, then we get into the requirements. And as a result, we have a much better idea what is in the realm of obtainium rather than unattainium. And we end up being able to produce a vehicle that we can actually do. And we can see what happens. And that's the model we're using. We're doing the same thing with Future Vertical Lift, where we want to pretty much fly before we buy. We want to drive before we buy, and we get an idea of what the actual capabilities of our of industry is to produce that type of vehicle or that weapon system.
We have a question about the IVAS, the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, which you had talked about,
right.
And I understand that it did have some technical problems, got pushed back a little, and so the question is about its status on testing and fielding.
Yeah, we're coming along. IVAS is, to me, very transformational. I use the example of the phone. The phone, we incremental, for a while there, it used to be on the wall, and then it was a cordless phone, and then we go into a cell phone, and we improved the phone as we went along. We're doing the same thing with our night vision goggles. Mm-hmm. We started out with full face goggles, and now we have these enhanced night vision goggles, Bravo, that fuse ambient capability with flare, and they're very good. But with IVAS, what we get is not only that capability for much better night vision or even day vision, because it's white phosphorus. It's transformational in that it brings in the capability to go into augmented or virtual reality, where you can, the vision for IVAS is you can train on it, you can rehearse on it, and you can actually go do the mission with it. Now, is it bigger and maybe more clunky than we want? If you remember the original, cell phone was kind of big and a little more clunky than maybe you wanted. IVAS is going through that process. It provides the capabilities that we want, but it's being hardened so it can go through the rigors of being on an infantry soldier, going through the brush, going through the deserts, going through getting wet and all those type things. And so it's coming along, mm-hmm. and I think it has transformational capabilities over the next couple of years.
Okay, great. Let me ask another question about another area that you touched on, which is the relations in the Army between the regular forces and the Guard and Reserve.
Yeah.
The Army, of course, over half is in the Guard and Reserve, and that relationship has sort of been good or sometimes not quite so good over time. General Milley put a lot of effort into it, and you seem to have continued that, so it's not, we don't hear much about it. And I was wondering about, what you have done, to sort of manage that problem.
Yeah. Well, I don't see it as a problem. I think it's
relationship.
Great.
Let me.
Well, yeah, that relationship. No, I'm just real. I speak a lot about the Guard and Reserve. Just real proud of them. They are like the Swiss Army knife of this nation. What they've done over these last couple of years. Incredibly impressed with how they've responded to COVID, how they've responded to national disasters, how they responded to operations on the border. You name it. They've been doing it. They've been overseas, and I think. Them knowing that they are a valued member of the team is really important. And some of that is more show me, Chief. You say that, but even how we're going to field equipment in modernization, historically it might have been, okay, the first regular Army 31 brigades get something, then we go to the Guard. We're not doing that. We're actually going up front. As we bring, new systems on, like Future Vertical Lift, we're working with the Guard and saying, okay, 101st, 82nd, 160th, and then we're going to field to the Guard. Then we're going to go, so they're going to be fielded, up front. We've picked a division of theirs that's going to get the most modern capability along with our 1st Cavalry Division, 1st Armored Division. So, they are an integral part of the team, and we want to make sure they have the resources they need up front, and we've been committed to making that happen. And so far, I mean, there's always tension when it comes to the budget, but I think we have a very good relationship with the National Guard and our reserves, and we need to.
We have a question, I think we pretty much covered it, but about re-engaging with Europe. I mean, we talked about possible restationing. Are there any other initiatives you see coming down the pike regarding re-engagement with Europe?
Well, the Army's, at least from where we sit, I think we've been very engaged, and we've shown commitment, really even over the last 2 or 3 years. You know, if you think about it, we used to have a 3-star headquarters there. We have a 4-star headquarters there, which means, you know, shows commitment from the nation. We stood up a corps, the 5th Corps, precisely to focus on Europe. So we have that capability, and you know, interesting enough, the first commander is Lieutenant General John Kolashevsky, and when we did the flag ceremony in Poland, opening up that thing, you know, the Poles were like, we have a Polish general coming in here, and so I think the relationships with our counterparts in Europe, at least in the Army side, I can speak for the Army because I know many of the chiefs, has been very, very strong, and we work together, we train together, and we are doing a lot of modernization together, and so I think that's very, very strong.
Let me ask a question about a topic that was, you know, I think maybe about a year ago, very hot, and that's about extremists in the military.
Yeah.
The DoD put out a report back in the late fall, which seemed to indicate that the problem might not be quite as severe as maybe people had thought it was. I mean, it still exists, but services have taken a lot of action in that regard. And I was wondering if you could talk about sort of the extent of the problem and what the Army's done.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to me, one is too many. You know, there's no room for extremism in the Army. People got to trust us, and, you know, trust the Army and trust the military. And, you know, we took a hard look across the entire force. You know, have we had extremists in the Army? We've had some. The numbers are very, very small, but we just want to make sure that we have, you know, a culture and a climate where people know that that type of behavior is harmful, both to the service, but it's also harmful to future recruits. You know, parents don't want to send their sons and daughters to a place that, you know, has extremists or has racists or has any type of people that conduct harmful behavior. So we're certainly watching it, but the numbers we've seen in the Army is small.
Okay, and that sort of brings up then the question about recruiting. You mentioned, you know, that the Army's done a lot of work to try to, you know, diversify and sort of welcome a wide variety of Americans. And I was wondering if you could talk about both efforts there and about the recruiting challenges and the successes that the Army's had.
Yeah, I think recruiting right now is challenging. You know, I'm a former G1, so I'm pretty much on the statistics about, you know, who's qualified. You know, we used to talk about, you know, 6 years ago, only 29% of Americans were qualified to come in the Army. Now we're at 23%. And, you know, so that makes it very, very challenging. And some have talked about, you know, the Army or the military being a family business. You know, I have 3 kids to serve and a son-in-law. Many of our senior NCOs and officers across the services have sons and daughters to serve. But, you know, we don't want it to be a military family business. We want it to be an American family business. And we got to do a lot of work to expose other young men and women who really don't have a tie to the military, for them to see, you know, the endless possibilities that they have by serving. And the same thing for their parents. You know, what a great place to start. It may be a great place to finish, but it's a great place to be in between. And I think we need to do a better job for American families of letting them know what the opportunities that there are. And COVID has just made everything hard. You know, we do most of our recruiting face-to-face, and high schools have been closed, and it's just been very, very challenging over the last 2 or 3 years.
And how do you do that? You talked about the military being a family business. You know, if you are Exhibit A, we are Exhibit B. You know, I served in the Marine Corps. My wife retired from the Army. 2 sons served in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
How do you get out to the broader American population now that we don't have a draft and the number of people actually serve is, you know, so much narrower than it was?
Yeah, I think we have to work at it. You know, I think sometimes, you know, our military posts, Army posts, are gated communities, and they're very difficult to get on. And so, you know, we've got to really reach out to people in cities and places where there's, not a lot of military. I come from the Northeast up, from Quincy, Mass, which is south of Boston, and you wouldn't see military there, so General Joe Dunford grew up in my neighborhood. We've had other folks that have come from that area. General Sullivan came from that area. But it usually was the result of maybe a parent or, close family member that served. And so what I tell our soldiers when they're leaving, we call them soldiers for life. And I give them 2 missions. I tell them, because they can't have 3, only 2. And what I want them to do is I want them to inspire and hire. When they leave the Army, I want them to go out and tell their story and inspire other young men and women to serve. And when they, make their riches, I want them to hire veterans. And that's the cycle that we want to have. And as they go out all across the country, we got to make sure people know of the opportunities. Because, I think in some ways we have young men and women who are going to miss a great opportunity to do one of the most important things in their life if they don't get a chance to serve.
And along that line, there had been some initiatives to put more recruiting efforts in places where the Army had not had recruited from before. On the other hand, the services, fish where the fish are. And how is that effort, playing out, going to places that have not traditionally produced a lot of recruits?
Yeah, I think it's balanced. And your point is we know where our recruits come from. In the Army, they come from a certain part of the country, and but we have lots of cities. We had a program with 22 cities that we were trying to have a greater presence. One of the interesting things that we've learned is we have junior ROTC in so many high schools, and we did some analysis, and what we found out was that 49% of the soldiers that come into the Army have a junior ROTC program at their high school. Now they weren't necessarily in it, but the fact that there was a junior ROTC program there, they got some type of limited exposure to the military, and that was enough to get them to go into the Army. And there's only 10% of high schools have JROTC. So there's something there, and we're trying to, get people exposure. And we've asked, I've asked all the commanders and all of our soldiers for life to help us recruit, help expose young men and women. Hey, if you're near a post, 101st Airborne Division, bring them by and let them see what soldiers do, because a lot of people have no idea what people do in the Army. And you can do anything, the Army has just tons of opportunities, anywhere from being a doctor to a nurse to a medic to being cyber to being infantry to being armored to flying. I mean, you can do about anything you want in the Army, and we'd like to give you the opportunity to do that.
Let me ask one last question. We're coming to the end of our time, but just to make an observation that I've seen the same thing too, that because military bases are now, because of security, very hard to get onto. Yeah. You see these notions, that mysterious things go on there. I mean, who knows, and really sort of unjustified. They're just mysterious to so many Americans. But we talked about recruiting of the enlisted, and I just wanted to ask a last question about recruiting of officers. Of course, the Army has a large ROTC establishment, and then the academies. I was wondering, how that is going.
Officers, we're doing extremely well. I mean, West Point is, one of those, universities very challenged to get into. We have lots of young men and women that want to go there, and ROTC is a wonderful deal if you get a scholarship. I'm the benefactor of 2 ROTC scholarships for my kids, and that's an excellent opportunity to allow young men and women to go to school. So there's great opportunities out there to get education, to get training. And right now we don't have any problem, recruiting officers. We don't take that for granted, but we're very comfortable with the recruiting we're doing for officers.
Great. Well, we've come to the end of our hour. Thank you so much for joining us, General McConville, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation. CSIS has a number of these engagements. We hope you will join us in the future. Thank you very much.